Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. After some requests, I want to take a small diversion in this video and have a look at some Unity basics. So to start, I'm going to cover instantiating GameObjects and using prefabs. If you want to add a GameObject to your scene from code, there are three ways to do it. First, you can just create a new GameObject directly. This will create empty GameObject in your scene. Second, you can use GameObject.create primitive. This creates a new prefab in the scene. You can specify which prefab it is that you're going to want to use. And the third way, you can instantiate a prefab. This will allow you to make more complex objects and instantiate them at runtime. I will also cover how to use coroutines to instantiate a lot of elements over a few frames. Let's jump in. The first thing I want to do is create a new script. So in my project window, I'm going to right click, go to create, monobehavior script, and I'm going to call this demo object creation. For now, I'm going to get rid of the update function. I can add it back later. I'm also going to remove this comment. And to stop Rider from complaining, we can right click and move this to the demo namespace. I'm going to start by defining some variables at the top of my class. The first one is going to be a serialized field, and I'm going to be defining a vector3, and this is going to be a center offset. In my world, I don't want everything created based around the 0, 0 point. This is going to allow me to define a point that's away from that, that's going to match with my terrain. We'll give it a default vector3, and I know that the values are going to be 23, 36, and minus 45. And then I've made it a serialized field because then if I want to in the inspector, I can change those values after the fact. Next, I'm going to create another private field. This is going to be a GameObject, and I'm going to call this empty parent. And this is the first thing that we're going to instantiate. If we go to our start function, IntelliSense has already set this up for us. All we have to do is assign to it new GameObject, and we can define a name, and in this case it's empty parent. I'm going to change this to demo empty GameObject. And now if I was to open my scene, open Unity and run this, we will get a new GameObject that has nothing in it with that name. Next thing I want to do is, again, IntelliSense has set this up for me, set the transform position to be the center offset. This is just going to move that GameObject to that position, ready for me to add more GameObjects as children of this object. Before going any further, I'm just going to refactor this. I'm going to create a new function, which I'm going to call create parent. And inside of that, I'm going to copy everything from the start function and paste it in there. And then call create parent from start. And that's it. Next, I want to generate some of the different primitive types, which I'm going to randomly place on the same plane as my parent object. So, to try and keep things tidy, we'll create a new function to do that. Call this private void create random primitives. We'll call this from the start function as well. Now I'm going to generate an unknown number. So to control that, I'm going to create a new serialized field. Which will be a private int. And we'll call this primitive count. And we'll default it to 10. Back in our function, we'll create a simple for loop. But for anyone who isn't familiar, we define a new integer of I, which is going to be our index. We set it to 0. We're then checking every time it loops if I is less than the primitive count or not. If it is, then it will do another loop, and then we increment the index. Inside of this function, we're now going to create our new primitive. Because I need to do some setup to that primitive every time it's created, we're going to store that in a new variable. So we'll create a new GameObject called primitive, and once again we can see IntelliSense has everything that we need. So I created a new GameObject called primitive, and then you can just call GameObject.createPrimitive and then pass in the type that you want to use. In this case, a sphere. That's all you need to actually create something. That will now be spawned within the scene, and if you were to run this now, you would have 10 spheres populated within your scene. So the next thing I want to do is not this. I'm not going to set the position first. The first thing I'm going to do is set the parent. So in this case, I'm going to do primitive dot transform dot parent equals empty parent dot transform, which is the empty game object that we created before. Now that I've done this, I'm now going to set the position. To do that, I'm going to do primitive dot transform. We are going to use local transform, and this is why we set the parent first, because now everything we're doing is going to be relative to the parent position rather than having to derive that later on. It just makes it slightly easier to follow the order of operations. However, I'm not going to be using the center offset because that's just going to offset it even more. What I'm going to use instead is a new vector3, and in there I'm going to use random.range, and it set this up for me for each of for x, y and z. That's probably a bit big. I'm going to set this maybe to between minus 50 and 50. Is that going to be too much? No, in fact I'm going to set this between minus 20 and 20. Now you can see I've not done that for the middle, for the y component. I'm just going to set that to 0. So they're all going to be on the same plane relative to the parent object. It's a bit beyond the scope of this video, but the next steps here might be to then do a raycast down to try and find the floor, and then position that as the set that as the y position. Before we go any further, let's check how this looks in Unity. To make this work, I'm going to create a new empty game object, which I'm just going to call main. I'll put this at 0, 0, and I'm going to attach the script that we've just finished writing. As you can see, our default center offset and primitive count has been set up. Let's now hit the play button. As you can see, we've got our demo empty game object. Inside of that are the 10 spheres that we created, and you can see them randomly placed within the area that I've defined. The last thing I want to show you is how you would use a prefab in a situation like this. So for that, we're going to add another serialized field, and for this we're going to have a type of GameObject, and we're just going to call this prefab. This is going to be a prefab that we will attach in the scene. So let's create another function. We'll call this create prefab, and again make sure this is called from the start function. In the create prefab function, first thing, create a reference. I'm going to call this prefab. In fact, no, I'm going to call this new prefab, so that I'm definitely not going to get confused with the serialized field above. equals instantiate and prefab, which that has in there. The one overload for the instantiate method that I'm going to use is to pass in a transform, which I'm going to use my empty parent dot transform. And then after that, I'm going to set up some locations. Given that in this instance it's already parented, I can do a new, I can do a vector3 dot 0 because I want it to be in the center next to that offset. Let's go back into Unity and see how that looks. Now back in Unity, if we go to our main game object, you can see we've now got this prefab field that we can populate. I already have a prefab that I have in mind. If I go to assets and then models, I'm going to use this feet cube. Just drag that into the prefab field, hit play, and you can see we've got a little feet character. I'm staying in the scene view just to be able to pan around, and we've still got all of our individual primitives that we set up before. It's obviously still floating off the ground, but that's just because I've done nothing to raycast them down onto the ground and place them there. You would probably want to do something along those lines in your own projects. There's one last thing I'd like to cover, so if we just go back to the code. The last thing I want to cover is how you can spawn your objects over several frames. You might want to do this so that your game remains responsive while you have a loading screen going on in the background, or you might just like the effect of things popping in over time. So to handle that, we're going to go back to the create random primitives function, and what we can do is change this from a private void to a private enumerator. And then within the for loop, at the end of it, I'm going to put a yield return and then a new wait for seconds. I'm going to change this to 0.5 of a second. Ooh, to 0.5 of a second. This really doesn't want me to put 0.5 of a second in here. It does take a float. We'll do 0.5. That's all that we need to do for this function, but you'll see we've got a bit of an error up here. What this is telling us is that this is not set up for a coroutine. There's a couple of different ways we can handle this. The simplest method is to do start coroutine and put our function inside of the argument for that. What will happen now if you hit play is you will see it create the parent game object. It will create the first primitive out of the loop, and then it will create the prefab, and then it will cycle through creating the rest of the primitives. Another way you could do this, if you wanted to have the prefab spawn after the all the other primitives have been created, is you can actually change the start function itself to an enumerator. The start function now will have start coroutine called on it by Unity, and now what you can do is get rid of this start coroutine and simply call yield return and then have that function. What will happen when you run now is the parent will be created. It will then loop through and create all of the primitives up to the primitive count. Then it will create the prefab. Now, I'd like my hero character to be displayed first, so all I'm going to do is move it above. And that's it. I might want something at the end of this. Let's put in a debug.log. And in here, I'm going to put a message which reads primitive count number of primitives created. And then I'll now have a console log which will tell me that everything is finished. The last thing I'm going to do, just for a bit of variety, at the top of this class, I'm going to create a private primitive type array. I'm going to call this primitive types, and I'm going to pre-populate this with primitive sorry, I forget I do need those brackets. And now I can pre-populate this with a number of different prefab types. I'm going to have cube, capsule and sphere, and then with this, inside the create primitives, I'm going to call primitive types and do a random dot range dot length -1. Sorry, every time it creates a primitive, it will select randomly from one of those types, just to provide a bit of variety. Now if we jump back into Unity, you can see my hero character has been created and my primitives are being generated. I hope this video has helped you get a better understanding of how to use GameObjects and prefabs. There is another video I can do on how to create different types of prefabs and how to make the most out of the system. Please leave a comment below if that's something you would like to see, or if there's a different topic you would like me to cover next. Please remember to like and subscribe to keep up to date with my future videos. Catch you next time.